At this point, the way in which economists see the world should be starting to take on some shape and focus in your mind. There's a division of labor that leads to exchange. Somehow, society has to coordinate everything that's produced by this divided labor and everything that people want to consume. In the next 6 lectures, we're going to extend and develop these ideas by laying out in a quite concrete way the economist's vision of how markets work. One way of doing that is to start with a circular flow diagram, which shows the economy as consisting of big circles of goods and services and payments. To think about the circular flow diagram in your mind, think about the economy as consisting of 2 big groups. One is households and one is firms. Those 2 groups work together or interact with each other in 3 main markets. The first market is a goods market. Goods flow from the firms who produce the goods and over to the households. Households make payments for the goods that flow back to the firms. In the jargon that I am slowly infiltrating into your brain, whether you know it or not, firms are the suppliers of goods and households are the demanders of goods. Now, a second broad market is the labor market. And in the labor market, labor flows from households, that is from people who work, and it flows over to the firms who hire those workers. And the payments go from the firms, when they pay the workers, back over to the households. So you can see why this forms a kind of a circle. The goods are flowing from the firms to the households, the labor is flowing from the households to the firms. The payments are all flowing around the circle as well. The third major market, or more appropriately the third major set of markets, is the financial market. Households save money. They save money and they invest it in firms in one way or another. The payments for those savings, the rates of return, the interest payments, the dividends, flow from the firms back to the households. So households are suppliers of financial capital and firms are demanders of financial capital. And again, you can imagine this circle flowing where the households are sending labor and savings over to the firms are taking the savings and the labor, creating production and sending the output back to the households. Now, just for the record, I should say that there are some people who would say that not only do people save and send money over to firms, but that firms also save money for themselves. There's of course some truth in that, but when a firm saves money, it's saving in a way on behalf of its shareholders and its owners. And so in some sense you can just argue over the definition, but in some sense it's saving on behalf of households. So we have this circular flow diagram looping around from one direction to another. And the firms are supplying capital when they earn a profit and reinvest in themselves. Now, because this is a circle, that helps to illustrate that anything that happens in one part of the circle, say in the labor market, is likely to have consequences in the goods market or the financial capital market. This economy is all tied together in this giant loop. Now, you can expand this vision of this basic circular flow. For example, we could add, along with households and firms, we could add the government as one more part of the economy. And you can have payments of taxes going over to the government and payments from the government going back either to firms or to households, depending on who gets that. Or you could expand and have another loop that would be the international trade loop or the rest of the world loop. And you could have exports going to the rest of the world and imports coming from the rest of the world and payments going back and forth. We'll talk about government and international trade as we go along. But for right now, let's keep it basic. 2 main sets of actors, households and firms, interacting in 3 markets: goods, labor, financial capital. In the next 6 lectures, we want to work through this structure of goods markets, labor markets, and financial capital markets. And we're going to start here with the goods market. Now, as a starting point for talking about goods markets, it's useful to first talk about prices. Now, of course, I've mentioned prices many times before as incentives for action, as being involved in the gains from exchange. But where do prices come from? At some basic level, where do they come from? Many non-economists, when they talk about prices, they refer to prices as being too high or too low in a sort of judgmental kind of way about the way they think the world ought to be. You'll hear people say things like, well, nurses are paid too little, or teachers are paid too little, professional athletes are paid too much. To an economist, this sort of judgment about what is too much or too little is a little bit like saying something like, the weather today is too cold or too hot. It tells you something about the preferences of the person. If someone says it's too cold, you know what they think about weather, but it doesn't really tell you anything about why the price or the temperature actually is what it is. To non-economists, prices are typically sort of value-laden. They'll say things like, gasoline costs too much, or the rent on my apartment costs too much, it went way up again. But to economists, when we think about prices, we don't want to think about them in terms of those sorts of value judgments. Again, everything goes back to Adam Smith for economists. And in his Wealth of Nations, he illuminated this distinction with what's come to be called the diamond water paradox. And Adam Smith talked about what he called value in exchange and value in use. Now, diamonds are something that have great value in exchange. If you trade a diamond, you can get a lot for it. But at Smith's time in particular, they had relatively little value in use. Industrial diamonds weren't a big thing back in 1776. So when we talked about diamonds, really we were talking about jewelry for rich ladies. So high value in exchange, not much value in use, or a sort of frivolous value in use. Water, on the other hand, Smith pointed out, is a basic necessity of life. It has very, very high value in use. If you don't have water, you die. But water is extremely cheap. Its value in exchange is very, very low. It falls out of the skies for free. You wring it out of your socks. And so with water, we have something where the value in use is very high, but the value in exchange is very low. Now clearly, value in exchange and value in use don't line up. And the question about prices is to say, which of these are we really talking about? Are we talking about the use and like whether or not people really can find something like water that they need, or are we talking about how much you can get for it? Well, when economists talk about price, we're talking about what you can get for it. We're talking about the exchange value. And the exchange value of a good is essentially related to how scarce the good is, which means, more or less, how much of the good is there relative to how many people want that good. Diamonds have a high price because compared to how many diamonds are available, lots and lots of people are willing to pay a lot for them. They're relatively scarce. Water has a low price because compared to how much is available, people are willing to pay not very much for it. They've got lots of it already available to them. And of course we can think about a situation where somebody in a desert who's dying of thirst might say, well, I'm perfectly willing to trade diamonds for water, because in that particular situation, water is going to be worth so much more to me. But that's just saying that in that particular situation, water is extremely scarce, and the diamonds perhaps seem not so scarce. So when we think about value, when we think about price, when you think about an economist, you think like an economist, you want to begin by just purging from your mind any thoughts about this underlying metaphysical idea of what things ought to be worth and their value in use. And you just want to think about value in exchange and how the scarcity relative to what people want determines the price. The dramatist Oscar Wilde once wrote in one of his plays, "A cynic is someone who knows the price of everything and the value of nothing." Economists take that literally. Economists are people who know the price of everything and the intrinsic value of nothing. When we talk about price, we're just talking about its exchange value. Chicken soup is cheaper than chicken cordon bleu, but that doesn't make chicken soup better or worse. It just means the price is less. A pro basketball player is paid more than a high school biology teacher. That doesn't make the person better or worse, or the job better or worse, or have any value implication at all. It just means they're paid more. when you get used to it, actually, this whole thing about separating prices from judgments about value is kind of emotionally liberating. You don't have to think about, is it really the right thing or the true thing or an accurate reflection of my values? Price is just what happens out there from the interaction of these forces, of what's available and what people want. Now, for economists, these ideas of demand and supply, which I've been tossing around kind of loosely, have really a quite specific meaning. And at the risk of pedantry, I need to walk you through this meaning so you'll have an idea of what economists mean when they talk about demand and supply. I know some of it may be a little bit dry, but it really should help to build a base of understanding that we can work with as these lectures go along. So let's first of all talk about demand. When economists talk about demand for a good, they're referring to a relationship between the price of a good and the quantity of that good that's demanded. Specifically, the relationship most of the time is that as the price of a good goes up, the quantity demanded of that good tends to drop. Higher price, people tend to want less of it. And you can sort of visualize this on a graph if you'd like to think in that particular way. You can imagine this graph has the quantity of a certain good on a horizontal axis, the price of the good on the vertical axis, and demand slopes down. And that downward slope tells you that as the price goes down and down, the quantity demanded gets bigger and bigger. Now, why is that? I mean, at some gut level, that should make some intuitive sense to you that, the price goes up, you get less, but why? What's the actual reason underneath? Well, there's two sort of concrete reasons economists have spelled out. One is the substitution effect. As the price of something goes up and up, people tend to substitute other kinds of things. So, for example, as the price of orange juice goes up, people substitute other drinks or vitamin C pills or just other things that they could have instead. As the price of gasoline goes up, people might drive less, they might join carpools, they might buy cars that have got higher gas mileage. There are a variety of ways of substituting in your behavior so that you can avoid using the higher priced gasoline. So one reason why, as price goes up, you demand a smaller quantity is this substitution. The other is what's called an income effect. An income effect means that as price goes up, the amount of income you have, in effect, has less buying power. And you can't buy everything you did before. If, for example, you're someone who likes to buy fancy coffee every morning on your way to work, if the price of coffee went up to $100 a cup, you probably literally couldn't buy that cup of coffee every morning. Your income, the buying power of your income in terms of coffee would be reduced. And even if it only goes up a little bit, the extra money that you have to spend comes from somewhere else. And so the buying power of your income is diminished when the price of a good goes up. And as that buying power is diminished, the income effect forces you to buy less of the good. Now, there's often a confusion, a big confusion, between demand and between quantity demanded, as economists use those two terms. Quantity demanded refers to a specific amount, a specific quantity that is desired at each given price. So I say, for example, as the price goes up, the quantity demanded drops and drops and drops as the price gets higher and higher. Demand refers to a relationship between price and quantity demanded. So demand refers to how much is desired at any possible price or at every price. Another way to put this in sort of graphical terms, for those who like to think in those terms, is that quantity demanded is a point or an amount. It's a quantity. But a demand curve is a relationship between price and quantity for a certain good. Now, with that distinction sort of between demand and quantity demanded in mind, let me ask you the trick question, which will let you know whether you've got the idea or not. The trick question is, if the price changes, what makes demand rise or fall? Or to put it a little differently, just what makes demand rise or fall? The answer is not price. Price doesn't make demand rise or fall. Price affects the quantity demanded, but it doesn't cause the demand relationship itself to move. For the demand relationship itself to increase, it has to shift so that at every given price, a larger quantity is demanded, or at every given price, a smaller quantity is demanded. Now, what could cause demand to change in that way? So that for every given price, more would be demanded, or for every given price, less would be demanded. Let me give you some examples. One would be, what if income goes up for society as a whole? A greater income for lots of people in society would mean more demanded of most goods anyway, at pretty much every price. So that tends to shift demand out for most goods. Another example would be changes in population. As the population expands, that tends to be more quantity demanded at every price. Another common example is a shift in tastes for a certain good. Certain things will become widely more popular or widely less popular, like a shift toward people consuming more chicken and fish or less beef and those kinds of things. A shift in tastes would mean that at any given price, more would be demanded, or at any given price, less would be demanded. Another thing that can change is the price of substitute goods. Imagine that we're thinking just about, for example, the price of the demand for beef. We're thinking about how much do people demand beef at any given price. Well, if chicken is a substitute good for beef, and the price of chicken goes way, way up, then people will go away from chicken and tend to demand more beef. Conversely, if a substitute good like the price of chicken went way, way down, people might go get more chicken, and then as a result they would get less beef. So demand for beef can be changed by the price of substitute goods. Now I want you to sort of hold in your mind that idea of demand and demand shifting and put it in one part of your brain and now talk about supply. Well, if we've got supply, we're going to talk about it in a similar way. When economists speak of supply for a good, they're referring to the relationship between quantity supplied and the price of that good. Specifically, the relationship is as the price of the good goes up, the quantity supplied of that good tends to go up too. And again, this should make some intuitive sense to you. As the price gets higher and higher, firms become much more willing to supply what that good is. You can visualize this on a graph. Again, it would be a graph with the quantity of the good on the horizontal axis, the price on the vertical axis, and the supply curve slopes up. That essentially means a higher price means more and more is going to be supplied. Now, why is that? Why does a higher price lead to a higher quantity supplied? Well, there's essentially two reasons. One is just that existing firms want to produce more as the price goes up and up. And of course, the other reason is that new firms might decide to enter the market if the price of the good they're selling goes up and up too. Now, just as there's often a confusion between demand and quantity demanded, there's a parallel confusion between supply and quantity supplied. The quantity supplied refers to the specific amounts produced at a given price. Supply refers to how much is produced at every price. Quantity supplied is a point, a quantity, and a supply curve is a relationship between price and quantity supplied. So again, here's our trick question one more time, right? The trick question is, what makes supply rise or fall? And if your answer is price, you're wrong. Because price doesn't move supply. Price causes the quantity supplied to change, but it doesn't shift the entire supply relationship. For supply to increase, the whole supply relationship has to move, so that at every given price, a larger quantity will be supplied. Conversely, for supply to fall, it has to be that at every given price, a smaller quantity is supplied. Now, what kind of things would move supply in this way? One would be a change in technology. For example, a cheaper way of producing could mean a greater quantity is going to be supplied of a certain good at every given price. Another thing might be weather. For a lot of products like agriculture, better weather means that more will be supplied at every given price, and worse weather could mean less will be supplied at every given price. Another factor would be input prices. If a firm uses a lot of oil or a lot of steel, and the price of the input goes up, then the quantity supplied at every given price is going to fall. Now, we want to take these two ideas of supply and demand and put them together at the same time in your brain. The easiest way to do that, I think, is start off by thinking about a really low price. At a really low price, the quantity supplied is pretty low because nobody wants to produce at a low price. But the quantity demanded might be really high because everyone wants to buy at a low price. Now, as the price begins to go up a little bit, the quantity supplied begins to increase. It's better for firms to produce, but the quantity demanded begins to drop off as people are discouraged from buying. And so as that quantity supplied rises and rises, and that quantity demanded falls and falls, at some point, the quantity demanded is equal to the quantity supplied. And that point is called the equilibrium. Now, let's think about what that equilibrium means for a moment. What would happen if price was above its equilibrium level? If price was higher than equilibrium, then firms love supplying stuff at the really high price, but people don't want to buy very much of it. So the quantity supplied is bigger than the quantity demanded. And stuff starts piling up on shelves. And to get rid of it, sellers are going to have to start cutting down their prices, and the price will slowly move down toward the equilibrium level, where the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded are in balance. If the price was temporarily below equilibrium, if it was temporarily low, then you're in a situation where the sellers begin thinking, why should we, if the price is so low, then why are we producing so much? Why are we producing so little? And the demanders think, oh, this is just super. So in that situation, people are lining up to buy things. People want to buy all kinds of stuff. And so as they're eager to buy things, the price begins to be driven up. Suppliers notice, hey, there are big lines of people waiting to buy things. And if there are big lines of people waiting to buy things, we can raise the price toward the equilibrium level. Only if quantity demanded and quantity supplied are equal to each other, only if you're at equilibrium, do you get this point of balance. This point of balance where there isn't extra building up on the shelves, nor are there big lines of people waiting to buy stuff. And so equilibrium is a balancing sort of point. It's the point toward which the economy tends to go. Now, just to be clear on this, I'm not claiming markets are always at equilibrium. There's an enormous dispute going back a couple hundred years over how long it takes markets to get to equilibrium and how close they are and whether they overshoot past equilibrium and bounce back and all that. All I'm arguing is that markets are typically tending toward the direction of equilibrium. Moreover, in a special sense that economists like to use this word, the equilibrium price and quantity are efficient. And efficient in a specific economic sense, which means that nothing is being wasted. Think again about what happens if quantity demanded is not equal to quantity supplied. If the two are equal to each other, then there isn't extra stuff piling up on shelves. There's nothing being wasted in terms of extra production, nor are buyers waiting in line. There's nothing being wasted in terms of people trying to get a certain product. An efficient machine has no wasted motion, no extra parts. An efficient market has no extra products sitting around or no extra demand for products that are not there. So when we think about something being efficient and in equilibrium, we want to avoid that situation where goods are piling up on shelves without being bought. That's clearly wasteful. We want to avoid the situation where people are waiting for something and they can't get it. That would be clearly wasteful. And the equilibrium outcome will be the best outcome in terms of avoiding that kind of waste. To phrase the same idea in a little bit different way, efficiency means that every seller who's willing to take the market price can find a buyer at equilibrium, and all buyers willing to pay the market price can find a seller at equilibrium. Indeed, it sort of defines the notion that a market equilibrium is kind of a win-win situation. There's a bunch of sellers who want to sell and are willing to sell at that price. There's a bunch of buyers who want to buy. They both perceive themselves as better off in terms of their own self-interest from buying and selling. Now, any change in demand or supply will cause demand and supply relationships to shift in a way that leads to a new equilibrium point. Consider, for example, the market for beef. If income rises, then the demand for beef goes up. As demand increases, there'll be a new equilibrium, which involves people buying more beef and paying a higher price. On the other side, you can imagine, say, if there was some outbreak of cattle disease, maybe that decreases the supply of the beef that's available. And that leads to a new equilibrium with people buying less beef and at a higher price. A lot of an academic class in introductory economics is devoted to thinking through the consequences of these demand and supply shifts. The specific goods and examples change, but this basic pattern of think about demand, think about supply, start at equilibrium, think about what would happen if demand or supply shifted, think about what new price and quantity would result at the new equilibria, and tell me the answer on a quiz. The supply and demand framework is intended as a framework for discussing how prices and quantities are determined in markets and why those market prices and quantities are going to change. Now, I should emphasize here that there is no claim here that everyone is happy about the equilibrium that results. There will always be buyers who say, boy, I would love the price to be lower. I really think I'm paying too much. And there will always be sellers who say, I can't believe it's selling fat. I would like the price to be higher. Equilibrium only means that quantity demanded and quantity supplied are equal to each other. It doesn't mean anything about how everyone will say, wow, I sure am grateful and happy that everything is at equilibrium. That's just not what it means. In fact, many people will go to the government, even when the market is at equilibrium, and lobby for laws that will change that outcome. There will always be buyers who would like the price to be lower. There will always be sellers who would like the price to be higher. And they're going to go to the government and they're going to complain. In the next lecture, we'll talk about some of the consequences of that behavior. Another complaint that's often made about this supply and demand model is that people say, real people don't think this way. This may make sense to you, but real people don't think this way, so how can that conceivably be a way that describes how the economy works? Well, that's actually a deep and a sophisticated question. I should say, first of all, this is not intended to be a literal description of how people think. But even if it was intended to be a literal description, it may be closer to reality than you at first think. For example, economists like to say, businesses definitely think this way. How do we know businesses think this way? It's because the managers of those businesses had to take economics in business school. So they think this way. They were trained to think this way. If you think about the individual behavior of consumers, it's reasonable to think that most people consider their desires, they consider what are the other options they could substitute, they consider how much money they've got, and they consider their own self-interest when they try and buy something. Well, that's precisely what I'm talking about here. That's precisely what demand is. Just that people thoughtfully sit down and try and contemplate what the possibilities are, and then they go out and buy accordingly. It's reasonable to think that most people consider their own desires and the amount of money that they've got on hand. And as long as that's reasonable, this model is reasonable too. Now, of course, most people don't walk out there with supply and demand curves and all of these relationships in mind. But if people look for the goods they prefer at the lowest possible price, and if firms adjust their production in response to changes in price, then people and firms are acting according to supply and demand. It's also true, as economists have long pointed out, that when there's a model of behavior, it doesn't have to be exactly identical to how people think. Imagine, for example, that you were trying to predict the speed and the arc of a pass from a football quarterback to a receiver. So you would use all these equations. You would use equations from physics about the weight of the ball and the force of gravity and the speed of the wind and all that kind of stuff. Now, a quarterback who throws a football doesn't know any of those equations. But they keep accurately throwing the ball over and over and over, accurately to where they want to. Similarly, economists believe that this idea of supply and demand captures what firms and people actually do, just in the same way that equations of physics capture what a quarterback does, even if it doesn't capture the thought process of what's happening. A supply and demand framework is an extraordinarily useful way of thinking about why prices are at the levels that they are, and why the prices might be rising or falling. It's an explanation that works for all sorts of products in markets all over the world at all different times of history. A lot of the complaints about markets and how they work, people don't like it that the prices for some things are high or low. They don't like the distribution of income, poor and rich. They might not like some of what is produced, fatty food, junk television. They don't like thinking about people are being selfish. I am not claiming in any way that any of this is likable or morally attractive or humanly desirable in some deep philosophical sense. I am only claiming that supply and demand is useful. It is a useful and powerful way of describing and understanding what actually happens, what actually determines the prices and outputs of goods. And as a useful mechanism, it applies extremely well across countries, across different goods, and across history.